All right, so if you guys want to have your notes out, we're, like I said, our focus is devolution today. And so here's the definition of devolution. And so this comes from your notes from last week. So this was all in your third note section. So your third note section had information about unitary and federal states, which was kind of our focus last week. It had a bunch of information about devolution. And then it also had information about electoral geography, which we haven't reviewed in class yet, but we will be reviewing this week. So there's a lot to that middle section of your note taking. But today and tomorrow, our focus is going to be on the concept of devolution. So devolution is the movement of power. So here is the definition: the movement of power from the central government to regional governments within the state. So last week we focused on the concept of federalism and federal states versus unitary states. And we said that unitary states, pretty much all of the power or most of the power is held in the central government level. Whereas a federal state shares power between the central government and the regional government. So when we think about regional governments, those can take many different forms. Within our country, we think about like state level governments. Within Canada, we think about province level governments. But we think about regional governments in many different forms. But the concept of devolution is that in some way, shape, or form, and this can play out in many different ways, but devolution is just the idea that there's power being held in the central government, and there is a movement of power. There's a shift in power away from the central government, and power is moving towards regional governments. So there's many different, we're going to look at lots of examples of devolution today. So hopefully you'll get a good idea of how this might play out in the real world. But there's many ways in which devolution happens. So here's some examples in this orange box here of examples of devolution. So let's say you have a country that is a unitary state. Most of the government or most of the power is held in the central government. The central government makes the laws, and that the constitution of that country gets rewritten, or there's changes that happen within that country, in that country's constitution, to create a federal system. That's devolution, because there was power that was really being held at that central government level, and now power is being shifted to, or it's now starting to be shared with those regional governments. Okay, that's a very peaceful form of devolution. Well, I guess it doesn't necessarily always have to be, but generally, devolution can range from very peaceful ways in which devolution happens to actually very violent ways as well. So another example of devolution might be more of a regional parliamentary government demands more power. So maybe you do have a unitary state, but there's a particular region of a country that demands more power. Maybe it is a region of a country that is ethnically different, or there's just different maybe economics within that region. And so they demand more power, and power is shifted and power is granted. Maybe so instead of granting an entire federal system to the entire country, maybe there's a region of the government that is granted a particular set of powers. They're given a little bit of autonomy. And many countries, including Spain, including China, as we're going to see tomorrow, many other different countries have regions within their country that are given a different degree of autonomy than the rest of their country. What does the word autonomy mean?
Amount of power.
An amount of power or self-rule. Yep. So autonomy really just means self-rule, and similar to sovereignty. They're given a degree of sovereignty. They're given a degree of being able to rule and have power themselves. And then kind of on the more extreme end, any type of independence movement. You have a region within a country that demands independence, or they attempt to secede from the country. So secession means to break away, to totally break away. A region of a government breaks away, or a region of a country breaks away. That is also devolution, because now instead of just giving like a degree of autonomy or maybe a shared sense of power, they're actually fully breaking away. So any sort of secession movement. So for example, prior to the Civil War, right? When the South seceded from the United States, right? They weren't successful because they fought a war, they were brought back into the Union. But that was devolution, right? The South was seceding from the United States. Those 11 states, the Confederacy, seceded from the United States of America. That's devolution. They attempted to gain their own independence, their own power. And then we will be talking about this concept of balkanization, which I'll have you guys write down that word when we get to that. So devolution is just any movement. So the confusing thing about devolution is that it is very much of a spectrum. Anytime we see this shift of movement away from the central government to a regional government, that's devolution. And we talk a lot about devolutionary pressures within a country. So oftentimes countries will have regions of devolution, or they'll have devolutionary pressures from regional groups of people. And that can come in many forms. So the next slide we're going to talk about is the types of devolutionary movements. So you have, how many guys are being blinded right now? Okay, so there's three kind of major, okay. So when we talk about devolutionary pressures or devolutionary movements, we oftentimes categorize them in the type of devolutionary movements there are. And we kind of categorize them in three different categories, three different subsets. So the first one is ethnocultural. So when you have a region or a nation, so we remember in the beginning of this unit, we spent a lot of time talking about different national groups or different types of states, whether they're multinational states or multi-state nations or stateless nations or whatever they were. Oftentimes, when there are nations within a state that define themselves as distinct, whether that be ethnically, linguistically, or religiously, and oftentimes all of these, they can demand, especially if a particular nation is focused in a particular area of a country, they can demand power for their region. So there's regions within countries that demand power regionally because they see themselves as their own nation. They see themselves as ethnically distinct. Okay, so that's an ethnocultural devolutionary movement. The second one is an economic. So this results from development gaps or economic gaps between different regions. So maybe there are some regions of a country that are pretty well off. They have a lot of industry. They may have resources like oil. They may be more of like a tech type industry. And that region of a particular country feels like they could do pretty well on their own. And because of that, they don't feel like they need the rest of the country because economically they're pretty stable on their own. And they either demand more from that country's government because maybe they're producing more. They feel like they're producing more than the rest of the regions of the country. And because of that, they're kind of really, a lot of the whole country's economy is kind of the weight of the entire country's economy is on the shoulders of that region, and they feel like they should get more power because of that. Or maybe there's regions that feel like they're being neglected by the central government. So the central government is ignoring a particular region. They're not giving them the same services economically. They're not, whatever it is, they feel like there's some sort of degree of economic neglect. And because of that, a region wants to secede. An example of this is Catalonia. So Catalonia is a region of Spain where Barcelona is. So Barcelona is the capital of the region of Catalonia. And Catalonia is much more economically profitable, comparably to their population at least, than many other regions of Spain. And because of that, and because they have a dominant capital, there's devolutionary pressures within Catalonia to secede. And Catalonia in 2017, I think that's right year, 2017 actually did vote for their own independence from Spain. What happened though? Can you remember? So it was denied. The Spanish government said, you can't do that. And there was like a whole bunch of protests and eruptions. And Catalonia is still part of Spain. However, many people within Catalonia believe that they successfully voted for independence. However, the Spanish government once again just said, nope, they sent in their police force and they said, you guys can't secede. That's not really part of our constitution, your constitutional rights. The other thing is that oftentimes you will have combinations of these. So Catalonia not only sees themselves as economically like sustainable as their own region or as their own country, but they are also they see themselves as ethnically different. So they speak a dialect of a particular dialect. They're linguistically different. They're ethnically different. They see themselves as their own nation. Okay, so oftentimes you'll see combinations of devolutionary forces. And then going along with the economic, an example. So although it hasn't really happened yet, what's the most economically profitable state in the country, in our country? California. Yep, it's also our biggest state, right? If California were to secede from the United States, it would. This is a statistic I heard a couple years ago, so I apologize if it's not entirely correct anymore, but it's got to be about the same. California as a country on its own will be the 6th largest economy in the world. Think about that. If California seceded from the United States, they would be the 6th largest economy in the world. That's crazy. And so this idea that like California could just at some point be like, you know what? We don't really like the way this country's going. We feel like we are producing a lot more for this country than we're getting back. California is a pretty liberal state. They might say, like, if we become more conservative, they might be like, we don't really feel like this country is, following our values. We're just going to secede. Now, obviously, we probably wouldn't just let them go, right? But that would be like an economic, they would feel like they had this economic, like, ability to just kind of leave. Or at least, and they can use that as leverage. So they can use that to kind of demand more power, to demand more resources, or to, possibly demand a little bit more autonomy, potentially. The last one is a spatial or territorial. And so generally, places that are more prone to devolutionary pressure are places that are distant or remote from the rest of the country, particularly of the capital. Oftentimes, you'll find devolutionary pressure on islands or in islands. So an example in the United States would be Hawaii. There's definitely there's many reasons why Hawaii feels separate from the United States, but one of the main reasons is that it's just geographically separate, right? It's very far away from mainland U.S. There's also like historical backgrounds, of colonialism, because basically the United States took control of Hawaii economically and militarily. And then there's also just like the ethnocultural. Many of you guys did the language case study on Hawaiian and how the people, if you guys remember that, the Hawaiian language was basically like used as a weapon, or people were being denied the ability to speak the Hawaiian language. And because of that, there's been attempts to revive the Hawaiian language, but people who are Hawaiian see themselves as very ethnically different than the rest of like mainland US. So that is an example of spatial devolutionary pressures, but also ethnocultural. So there's a map in your textbook that looks like this. So this is Europe, and this is many different examples of regions of devolution. So you'll notice that, here's Catalonia right here. So Catalonia, if we look at Spain, is once again has some economic devolutionary pressures. It has ethnocultural, but it's also kind of just remote. It's kind of on the edges. Oftentimes you'll find regions that are on the edges of countries within the United Kingdom, or, Great Britain, or whatever you want, the United Kingdom. You'll find Scotland, you'll find Wales, you'll find Northern Ireland. Those are different regions that see themselves as they speak different languages. They probably also speak English, but they speak different languages. They're ethnically different. The Welsh see themselves, or the Irish see themselves, or the Scottish see themselves as different than the English. So there's these regional devolutionary pressures. But you oftentimes see islands also, that spatial devolution, as well as other things. So, all right. So we're going to do talk through a couple of case studies. By the way, for our for Unit 4, you do need to know a number of examples. Okay, and so one of the examples that you do need to know is the Soviet Union. So I would write this into your, and we're going to go over it very briefly. You don't need to know the entire history, but we're going to go over some examples, historical examples of devolution. And there's actually not too many times in the AP curriculum where they tell you you need to know this specific example. Oftentimes you need to know larger concepts. You would need to be able to apply larger concepts to examples, but there's very few times that you actually need to know like really specific examples. But these are the ones I'm giving you here today are ones that are written in the course guide as examples you need to know. We're going to go over them very briefly. These are in your notes. You don't need to know everything about them, but you might be asked to answer a question on an exam, whether it be the AP exam or even your exam next week, related to particular examples. So one of the case studies of devolution is the Soviet Union. So the Soviet Union, which we think of as Russia, or sorry, what we think of today as Russia, but the Soviet Union existed from 1917 to 1991. So for the majority of the 20th century, as communist Russia. And starting in 1988, we start to see what we call the fall of the Soviet Union. But really, this is the Soviet Union, and the Soviet Union encompassed a number of countries that we think as independent countries today, because they are independent countries. But we think, so this is the Soviet Union much larger than what we think of as Russia here today. So in the late 1980s, so 1988, there starts to be some internal disintegration within the USSR. And although these countries that were once part of the Soviet Union and exist as countries today, all of these people within the Soviet Union, which was an incredibly multinational country, right? They're still a multinational country today, but these regions, people saw themselves as Ukrainian. People saw themselves as Belarusian. And there was much growing, there started to become growing unrest in the constituent republics. And so constituent republics were basically the regions within Soviet Union that were that were once again like Ukraine and Belarus and Kazakhstan. And it developed into this incessant conflict between the republics and the central government, and it eventually leads to the dissolution. Is that the right word? Am I pronouncing that right? Probably. Dissolution. It's like dissolving, right? Dissolve. It comes from the word dissolve. I just don't know. I don't oftentimes say the word dissolve in that form. The dissolution of the Soviet Union, the creation of multiple new states. So we have, here we got Ukraine, we have Kazakhstan, we have the countries of Georgia and Armenia, we have Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia. So all of these nations, or all these countries were created after the disintegration of the USSR. So that is just kind of a concept that you should know. But as we take a look at political conflict today, we oftentimes still see a lot of ways in which Russia oftentimes still tries to control many regions. Last week, there were large-scale protests in what country? Yeah. Kazakhstan. Yeah, there were large-scale protests in Kazakhstan. And the Kazakhstan government, so Kazakhstan is this country right here. Very large, spatially country. But there's very much still like ties to Russia. And much of Russia, like Russian oil and Russian natural gas gets exported through Kazakhstan as well as through Ukraine, which they've also had some conflict with Ukraine. But I think I read about 17% of Kazakhstan, the people living within Kazakhstan, a good chunk, almost like a fifth of the people living within Kazakhstan, see themselves still today as ethnically Russian. So there's very much these ties between Kazakhstan and Russia. And Kazakhstan actually called in Russian troops to help put down the protests and ended up firing on many different protesters and killing a number of protesters. So that was all just last week. But there's very much still these ties to Kazakhstan. However, Kazakhstan also kind of is starting to align itself a little bit more with China, which definitely put some pressures. And Russia and China are also starting to align themselves a little bit more with each other. So there's these geopolitical pressures to, but a lot of it is this ties back to the ethnicities. And even in Ukraine, like as we talked about Ukraine and how Russia pretty much just took over Crimea in the early 2010s and has never given it back. The international community said, you can't just invade another country and take over a region. And they're like, well, we just did. And what are you guys going to do about it? But a lot of that was also just based on this fact that a lot of Crimeans saw themselves as ethnically Russian. And so this idea that it wasn't just an invasion, but maybe it was a liberation. Maybe it was the Russians coming in and taking control of that. So this was a 2019 FRQ question that asked us a question about the Soviet Union. So because of this, I don't necessarily expect that the 2022 FRQ question will be about the Soviet Union. But it says, identify one geopolitical event that initiated change in the number of international boundaries in Europe between 1980 and 2013. So you'll take a look. It showed a map of Europe here in 1980. It showed a map of Europe in 2013. And you can see just the changes in European boundaries. And one of the answers you could have given would have been the breakup or the fall of the Soviet Union. You could have also talked about the reunification of Germany, because in 1980, Germany was East Germany and West Germany and became unified in the late 1980s, 1989 maybe. You also could talk about Yugoslavia, which we haven't got to yet, but we'll talk about on a following slide. Okay, one other case study that you need to know, and once again, for these case studies, you really just need to be able to identify this fact that certain types of pressures, devolutionary pressures, are causing either the breakup of a state or the independence of a state. And another example, very brief example that we're going to talk about, and then like I said, you're going to be looking at some of your own, is Eritrea. So Eritrea, I'm going to pull it up on a map really quick because this map doesn't really give us a good sense of where it is. And then you guys probably already know. I just want maps. Okay, so Eritrea is a country in East Africa. So we have Eritrea here, Ethiopia, here's Somalia, here's Djibouti. But this is Eritrea right here, okay? So kind of a small country nestled in between Sudan and Ethiopia. And so this is also an example of devolution, and it's an example of kind of an independence movement. So it was multinational states, diverse groups of peoples, languages, and religions, but this one also ties back to colonialism. So after the Berlin Conference, Eritrea was a colony of Italy. So it was an Italian colony. And after World War II, the Italians were part of the Axis powers of Germany, Italy, and Japan. And the Italians were expelled during World War II by the British. In the 1950s, the United Nations debated over the sovereignty of Eritrea. And basically, the United Nations, instead of giving Eritrea its own independence, it basically gave it to Ethiopia. So from the 1950s to 1993, Eritrea was part of Ethiopia, but also fought in a very long war, 30-year war, for independence. And so with that, so within Eritrea, even though they were multinational, even though there were many different groups living within Eritrea, there were rebel groups within Eritrea that were constantly fighting for 30 straight years for independence from Ethiopia, and finally granted independence in 1993. So once again, example of devolution, and very much this example of devolution is very much of that independence type, also very, very violent devolution in terms of war and conflict, eventually leading to full independence. All right, so we're gonna talk about. Actually, we're gonna skip this for now. We'll come back to this. because I want to get you guys into your case studies. All right, so if you guys have had to Schoology, open up the head to Schoology, go to your upcoming, and in your upcoming, you'll see due on Wednesday, the Devolution case studies assignment. And so what you're going to do here is you're going to be taking a look at 3 different case studies, and you're going to get a chance to choose which ones you take a look at. So I'll give you guys a second. So head to the Devolution case studies assignment, which is in your upcoming. It's due on Wednesday. And as you find that assignment, the first thing it's going to ask you to do, and hopefully I have the settings right, it's going to ask you guys to open up a story map. So the first thing I need to know is is the story map working?
Yep.
It is? Good. Thank you. Okay. So key questions. How do states spatially organize their governments? That is focused on federalism versus unitary states. So this concept of federalism and unitary states very much ties in with devolution. Once again, one way in which devolution is seen is through the creation of a federal system. But oftentimes unitary states will face a lot of devolutionary pressure, and federal states do too, but unitary states may face a lot of devolutionary pressure. And one way to, when you think about like a country, you think about there's regions within this country that are wanting to secede, or maybe they're wanting more power, or they're creating potential conflict and centrifugal forces for this country. One thing that countries will do, or one thing that central governments will do in order to alleviate those pressures, is to grant particular regions more power. Whether they do that through creation of a federal system, or whether they do that on kind of a one-off basis by creating, giving some regions of a country a little bit more power. So oftentimes, the way in which countries are spatially organized can influence the devolutionary pressures. So you're going to read about devolution definition and types of devolution. It does go a little bit into unitary versus federal states. So this is really just review. So you're going to find this is kind of just notes here. You're going to see a practice FRQ. However, we did this practice FRQ last week, so I kept it here just because it was something I had on the original thing. And then it's going to focus on the results of devolution. So the results of devolution come in many forms, but we're going to focus for these case studies on balkanization or independence. So this concept of balkanization is the breakup of a state. This idea that through devolutionary pressures, sometimes countries get broken apart. Regions secede, those regions are granted independence. And so balkanization or independence is a result of devolution in which countries break apart into newly independent regions, or a region secedes from a country. An autonomous region. So an autonomous region is when a particular region of a country is given some degree of self-governance or autonomy from the central government. This map does not show. Oh yeah, this map does show countries that all of these countries in green right here have, to some degree, autonomous regions within their country. There's regions that have some degree of autonomy. In the United States, what would we consider an autonomous region? A region within our country that has some degree of autonomy. This is different than federalism. So we have a federal system in which our states have power to make some laws, and our central government we share power, right? But we also have autonomous regions within our country. We have regions within our country that are still part of the United States, but to a large degree have their own power to make their own rules. Yes. Yep. So our American Indian reservations are examples of autonomous regions. They have their own judicial system. They have their own police force. They have laws. Okay, so sometimes people will say, well, yeah, how do they have their own laws, right? But they have the ability to make their own laws and their own rules and their own systems outside of the U.S. government. There's a relationship between the United States government and American Indian reservations that basically say you guys have your own power. And a lot of countries have these autonomous regions, or at least semi-autonomous, meaning that they have some degree of power. And then the last one's going to be a referendum for independence. So some regions have had votes on independence. Some of those votes have been successful, and some of those votes have not been successful. So a referendum is basically a vote. Let's hand it over to the people. Let's see if the people want to become an independent country. In 2000, now I'm going to get the date wrong, early 2010s, which country or which region of Great Britain, of the UK, voted on their own independence? You guys were young back then. They did it. They voted against it. The region said, nope, we're going to stay within the UK. But they held a vote, and the UK was ready to let them become their own country if they said yes. Yeah. Scotland. Yes. Scotland within the UK voted on their independence, whether or not, and they voted no. So it was a failed referendum. Catalonia, as I said, had their own referendum. And they voted yes. However, they weren't ever granted by the Spanish government, and they're not recognized by the international community. So how do you actually get independence? Well, you need to, you need to be, as any state, you need to be recognized by the international community. So the international community, the United Nations, does not recognize Catalonia as its own state yet. Okay. So what you're going to do is you are going to choose three. You are going to choose, you're going to choose one. This is not a word. What should I write here? Why does it say VOM? Thanks. But then I have the O and the M and then the E. I have no idea what I just did there. Okay. So you're going to choose one case from each example category. So there's 3 example categories. The example categories are in pink or in purple or whatever you want to call that. And so there are 2 independence examples. There are 2 autonomous region examples, and there are 3 referendum examples. Okay, so you're gonna look at these examples and you're gonna choose one from each category. So how many are you doing total? 3. Good. Okay, you're gonna do 3 total. Now the confusing part is, for each of the examples, you're gonna answer all of these questions. So if you want to, after you've chosen it, you can copy and paste these questions into the one that you want to do. Okay, so let's say you can renumber them. I'm going to do South Sudan. I am answering all of these questions. So yes, it's like you're doing 3 examples, but you're going to answer a number of questions for the 3 that you're going to do. Okay, so you're doing 3 total. You are going to write down, you're going to answer these questions. So how is this region different from the other regions of the country? These are sub-questions, so you don't necessarily need to answer all of these questions, but you do need to answer the larger question, and those sub-questions are kind of helping you or hinting at how to answer the larger question. Is this an example of territorial, ethnocultural, or economic devolution? It could be a combination of multiple. What geographic features led to devolution? Geographic would mean physical features, differences in space, how things are laid out. What historical factors led to devolution? Oftentimes, many regions of devolution, particularly in regions that were colonies, have colonialism is very much a factor in devolutionary pressures. So as we take a look at boundaries and boundary creation and the superimposed boundaries, oftentimes those superimposed boundaries lead to devolutionary pressures. They lead to regions within countries that want to secede. And then, is this region a unitary or a federal state? And do you think that contributes to devolution within the region? Why or why not? So you have 4 minutes maybe to choose which ones you're going to do. So when you go down, you're going to find the examples down here. If you roll your mouse over these, you're going to find where to find the examples. You can kind of jump to them. And it does give you a lot of the information. So it'll give you the example, and then it'll give you the quote-unquote mother country. What I mean by mother country is the country that this is a region of, or was a region of. South Sudan is the newest country in the world, and East Timor is the second newest country of the world. Both gaining they're the only two countries that have gained independence in the 2000s. All right, so you guys can take a look at that. Let me know. I'll walk around if you guys have any questions.